you ever been driving alone on a deserted road late at night, with nothing but the dark stretch of asphalt and the distant glow of your headlights to guide you? Imagine this. You see someone up ahead, standing on the side of the road. A frail, elderly woman who looks lost and desperate. What would you do? Would you stop to help? Or would you keep driving, feeling that nagging voice in the back of your mind telling you that something isn't quiet, right? Sometimes the choices we make in those fleeting moments can change everything. And sometimes they can lead us into a nightmare we can never escape. Please enjoy our new story. It was one of those nights when the darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides like a suffocating blanket. My car was the only one on the narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest. The headlights barely pierced the blackness, revealing just a few meters ahead before the night swallowed everything again. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your senses heighten, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I should have been home hours ago, but work had kept me late, and now I was regretting every moment that had led me to be out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The road was eerily quiet, not even the usual hum of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl. Just the dull roar of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. I was starting to feel uneasy, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds as if expecting something to be there, lurking just out of sight. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, an old woman standing by the side of the road, her hunched figure barely illuminated by the dim glow of my headlights. She was dressed in a tattered shawl, the kind you'd expect to see on someone's grandmother, and she was clutching a small bundle close to her chest. Her face was shadowed, but I could make out the deep lines of age, the sagging skin, and the wild, unkempt hair that framed her head like a tangled halo. She looked lost, out of place, and vulnerable. Every instinct in me screamed to keep driving, to not get involved. But then, something made me slow down. Maybe it was the way she stood there, almost as if she was waiting for me. Or perhaps it was the faint glimmer of desperation in her posture. Whatever it was, I found myself easing off the gas, my foot hovering over the brake. As I got closer, I could see her eyes, dark, hollow, and staring directly at me through the windshield. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I pushed it aside. She was just a helpless old lady, lost in the middle of nowhere. How could I not stop? I rolled down the window, hesitating for a moment before I spoke. "Do you need help, ma'am?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, shaky and unsure. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a step closer to the car, her eyes never leaving mine. There was something off about her, something that didn't quite fit, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I should have trusted my gut, but instead, I waited. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, raspy and dry like old leaves rustling in the wind. "Please, my granddaughter. She's lost. Can you help me find her?" The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. I hesitated, my mind racing. This didn't feel right. Why would an old woman be out here, in the middle of nowhere, looking for her granddaughter? And why was there no sign of the child? But then again, how could I ignore her plea for help? If it were my grandmother, wouldn't I want someone to stop? The internal conflict gnawed at me, and I found myself nodding before I even realized what I was doing. Of course, get in, and we'll go find her. As soon as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that never reached her eyes. She moved slowly, deliberately, as she opened the car door and slid into the passenger seat. The smell hit me immediately, stale, like something that had been left to rot. I nearly gagged, but I forced myself to stay calm, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread curling in my stomach. The woman didn't say anything more, just pointed ahead into the darkness. I pulled back onto the road, driving slowly, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Why hadn't I seen a child on the road? Why hadn't she called for help earlier? The questions piled up, but I kept them to myself, too afraid of what the answers might be. The further we drove, the more the unease grew, until it was a tangible thing, pressing down on me with every passing minute. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding deeper into the forest, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. I glanced over at the woman, hoping to find some reassurance, but she was just staring straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. Her silence was unnerving, but I didn't dare break it. Instead, I focused on the road, the beam of my headlights cutting through the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, she whispered, "Stop." The word was so sudden, so sharp, that I slammed on the brakes without thinking. The car skidded to a halt, and I sat there, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had just happened. The woman was already out of the car, moving faster than I would have thought possible for someone her age. She stood by the side of the road, pointing into the trees. "She's in there," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Please, you have to help me find her." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the car, to drive away and never look back. But something held me there, a strange compulsion that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the fear in her voice, or the way she looked at me, her eyes pleading and desperate. I couldn't just leave her out here alone, not without at least trying to help. So, against my better judgment, I got out of the car and followed her into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out what little light the moon provided. The further we went, the darker it got, until I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. The woman moved with surprising agility, her shawl trailing behind her like a shadow. I struggled to keep up, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stumbled over roots and rocks. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind in the trees. "Just a little further." I didn't know how long we walked, but it felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, a never-ending maze of darkness and shadows. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, we reached a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the scene before me. In the center of the clearing was a small, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. The woman stopped at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the cabin. "She's in there," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to help her." Something about the cabin sent a jolt of fear through me, a primal instinct warning me that this place was wrong, that I shouldn't be here. But before I could say anything, the woman was already moving towards the cabin, her steps slow and deliberate, I followed her, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and run. As we approached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The air around it was colder, almost unnaturally so, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the sickly, sweet stench of decay. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to turn and run back into the woods. But I couldn't leave her, not now. Not when we were so close. The woman reached the cabin door and pushed it open with a creak that echoed through the clearing. She stepped inside, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the walls were lined with deep, gouging scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The smell was overpowering now, making my eyes water and my throat burn. "She's in here," the woman said, her voice low and urgent. She was standing in the center of the room, her back to me, pointing towards a dark corner. I couldn't see anything, just shadows upon shadows. But I had come this far, and I couldn't back out now. I took a step closer, then another, peering into the darkness. That's when I saw it. The bundle she had been holding earlier, now lying on the floor. But it wasn't a child. It was, I don't know how to describe it. A twisted, malformed thing, wrapped in old rags, its shape barely human. It was as if something had tried to create a child, but had gotten it horribly, horribly wrong. My stomach lurched, and I stumbled back, choking on bile. What is that?" I managed to gasp, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness. Her skin a sickly gray, stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. Her mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of yellowed, jagged teeth. "Thank you for bringing her home," she said, her voice no longer weak and frail, but cold and sharp like a knife. "We've been waiting for someone like you." Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, she lunged at me. Her movements were impossibly fast, too fast for someone so old and frail. I tried to scream, tried to run, but she was on me in an instant, her hands cold and strong as they wrapped around my throat. I felt the world start to fade, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint of light as her grip tightened. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, my head spinning. When I looked up, the woman was gone. The cabin was empty, the bundle lying in the corner undisturbed. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and bolted out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. I never looked back, not once. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and floored it, tearing down the road as fast as I could. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that place, away from whatever that thing had been. I drove for what felt like hours, not stopping until I saw the lights of a town up ahead. Only then did I pull over, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely turn off the engine. I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. It didn't make any sense. None of it did. But one thing was clear. I had made a terrible mistake. I had stopped when I shouldn't have, and now I would never be the same. To this day, I can't drive down a lonely road without feeling that same cold dread creeping up my spine. I can't see an old woman without thinking of those hollow, empty eyes, that twisted grin. And I can't stop thinking about that cabin and what might still be lurking inside it, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to come along. So, if you ever find yourself driving down a dark, deserted road and you see a lost granny standing by the side, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop. Because some roads lead to places you can never come back from. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit the like button and let me know in the comments what you would have done in my place. Would you have stopped? And if you want more creepy stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and check out my other videos. You never know what might be lurking in the dark.